In our last few episodes, we've been able to dig into the Cold War, how it started, and what resulted from it. We've talked about tensions between East and West, communist totalitarianism and democratic capitalism, the creation of competing alliance systems, nuclear proliferation, proxy wars, and mutually assured destruction. Most of that was centered on the two poles of our bipolar system, the USA and the USSR, who came to stand in as the champions of their respective systems. In 1949, it almost seems as if the balance of power swings from the side of the Western democracies to the Soviets and their satellites when China falls to communism. And that's how it's branded, China falling to communism. In my bonus episode on China's Civil War, I talk more about how that happens, but get ready for the basics. So you will remember in the end of the Qing Dynasty episode, I believe it is in 7.1, I talk about how Sun Yat-sen was basically supporting socialist ideas. And so China's post-dynastic revolution had strains of socialist thought running through it since the beginning. And after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the USSR was using its influence to try and spread communism, especially by hyping up and supporting communist parties and revolutionary groups around the world. And they definitely started doing this in China. Their efforts stall in the 1920s because the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, often abbreviated as KMT, let me go ahead and write that for you. So the KMT and the CCP form an alliance in 1924 to combat warlordism. Remember that after the fall of the Qing Dynasty, the new republic lacked the ability to centralize control, and a bunch of rural landowners kind of strike out on their own, basically a version of feudalism in the 20th century. This alliance was also supported by Comintern, which was the Soviet Union outreach branch. It stands for Communism International. This alliance, the First United Front, lasts until 1927, when a super conservative faction of the KMT organized a massacre of communists in Shanghai, officially breaking the alliance and the KMT party into two. Chiang Kai-shek comes to lead the conservative faction based in Nanjing, and this basically counts, this 1927 date, as the start of the civil war between the communists and nationalists, with Chiang Kai-shek on one side and Mao Zedong on the other. Mao, who had been born a rural peasant but educated at the university in the city of Beijing, had become familiar with Marxist thought. But during the 1920s, he joins the alliance with the KMT. He worked extensively with peasants in the countryside and became convinced that if they were ever able to organize and rise up, it would be the world revolution that Marx had foreseen. After the 1927 massacre, Mao begins to organize the peasants into guerrilla bands in the mountains. And that's pretty much how the Civil War proceeds until things with Japan start to go sideways in the 1930s, particularly after the Manchurian Incident of 1931. As the Second Sino-Japanese War bogs down and the Japanese army commits atrocities against Chinese civilians, a second alliance between the CCP and the KMT is formed to fight off the Japanese. This is creatively called the Second United Front, by the way. This lasts only as long as the war, though. And by 1945, the Civil War is officially back on. During the war, the people's opinion of the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek as a person had decreased pretty dramatically. Chiang hadn't really seemed very interested in protecting the people against the Japanese, while the CCP had been out defending cities and villages against the Japanese forces. So, the war that breaks out again from 1945 until 1949 is a different war, and despite all the money and the advisors that the U.S. throws at Chiang, his ego and his unpopularity can't be overcome, causing him to lose the war and retreat to Taiwan, which he says is the Chinese government in exile. This is a big blow to U.S. foreign policy, and part of what influences Truman's containment policy, which is eventually the dominant U.S. foreign policy of the Cold War. It's furthered by Eisenhower's domino theory, the idea that if one more place falls to communism, it signals a rapid conversion, like dominoes falling after the first is knocked over. So China, with its markets, its production, and its sizable population falling to communism, is a major stumbling block and basically results in the U.S. getting involved in both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, because this just couldn't be allowed to happen again. But happen again, it would. In many post-colonial regions, in Africa, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Latin America, who is trying to redefine its role with the West, the legacy of imperialism or Western domination inspired many revolutionaries or other leaders to forge movements to redistribute land and resources, and often these movements advocated for socialist or communist policies. The example we're going to talk about today is Chile. In Chile, Salvador Allende, a scientist, Marxist, activist, and politician, won election as president in 1970. After his inauguration, he started to implement what he saw as necessary reforms along socialist lines while still maintaining democratic systems and civil liberties. What he did attack was big corporations. For example, he expropriated U.S.-owned copper mines without any compensation to these companies. He also attacked low wages and unemployment by increasing wages and watching as demand increased because now the average person had more disposable income to spend. Unemployment dropped, and that helped to ease some of the fears of the wealthy, many of whom had fled Chile or tried to otherwise hide their assets. The resulting inflation, though, destabilized Allende's program. There was little investment, both from private corporations who were too scared, private individuals who were also too scared, and the government, which just didn't kind of plan for it. And after only 1 year, the redistribution of wealth he had attempted began to dry up. Fidel Castro in Cuba even commented, quote, "Marxism is a revolution in production. Allende's was a revolution in consumption," end quote. And this consumption just wasn't sustainable without serious supports that his government did not put in place. It didn't really matter, though, because later in 1970, President Nixon had a confidential meeting with then CIA Chief Helms to overthrow Allende using, quote, "the best men we have," end quote, and to, quote, "make the economy scream." Following that meeting, the CIA began pursuing options like a military coup to overthrow Allende to ensure that these socialist policies would not continue. Not everyone was on board. According to documents just declassified in September 2020, a deputy in the National Security Advisor's office, Vaikon Vaki, questioned whether or not, in light of the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, that the plan to oust Allende could actually cause more harm than good. His concerns were dismissed by Chief National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and plans moved forward. Guns, money, and even life insurance policies were provided to those in the military who could help instigate a coup. And a military leader who came out to CIA operatives as against the plan ended up shot and killed in 1970. I wonder how. Over the next 3 years, Allende he's president from 1970 to 1973. The CIA's efforts to destabilize the government enough to create a, quote, coup climate paid off. And on September 11th, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a military takeover that resulted in the death, whether by suicide or murder is unclear, of Salvador Allende. Quote, "Carnage will be considerable and prolonged," a top CIA cable from the Santiago, capital of Chile, station predicted as agents began actively implementing Nixon's orders. Quote, "You have asked us to provoke chaos in Chile. We provide you with formula for chaos that is unlikely to be bloodless. To dissimulate the U.S. involvement will clearly be impossible." So the U.S.'s involvement in this takeover is pretty obvious. At the time, though, they obviously refused to acknowledge any involvement. Augusto Pinochet is most famous as a sadistic dictator who regularly suppressed political dissent by disappearing anyone who questioned him. Disappeared as in the book 1984 Disappeared, where you're thrown into a van with a black bag on your head and you never come back, and your family is too afraid to ask what happened to you. But hey, they weren't socialist, and they were friendly to U.S. interests, so you make the call there. Other reactions to the threat of communist takeover include the White Revolution in Iran. But first, a little bit of background. During the 19th century, Iran had been ruled by Persian shahs who were deeply influenced by both Russian and British imperial interests. Growing Iranian nationalism after the turn of the century resulted in a growing constitutional movement with varying levels of success. But a parliament was established, but the upper house was always selected by the Shah. So, a little bit of good and a little bit of not good. What did remain clear throughout this movement in the early 20th century, though, was that the upper classes, particularly the Shahs and the upper echelons of society, were deeply entrenched with Western business interests. So, when in 1950, a particularly anti-Western socialist reformer named Mohammad Mossadegh, here he is elected prime minister, the Shah and the Western business owners are not happy. Here's the Shah, looking classy. One of the first things that Mossadegh does is he actually nationalizes the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The British were really upset about this because they owned it. And so they reached out to the U.S. for help. And so, in response to this, the U.S. foments a military-backed coup of Mossadegh. So, say bye, Mossadegh. The Shah then is able to return to power. Here he is. There's his name. And he pretty immediately returns the rights of foreign companies as long as they continue to back him. This wasn't super popular with his people, who had actually really loved Mossadegh. So, in order to limit the possibility of socialism gaining more strength, in 1963, Shah Pahlavi, seen here, institutes what he calls the White Revolution, a series of sweeping reforms including profit sharing for industrial workers, the privatization of government-owned industries, welfare for needy mothers and infants, increased education, voting rights for women, and the expansion of healthcare into rural areas. The White Revolution was moderately successful. More people were able to enter the middle class, and with that growth in the middle class also came a growth of resentment towards the government, which was seen as corrupt, and the Shah, who was seen as not really interested in giving up a lot of his power. Of course, the landlords and the more conservative parts of the clergy were also less enthused about these reforms. In fact, the clergy was so anti these reforms that they staged a revolution in 1979, overthrowing the Shah, ending the reforms, and creating a theocracy in its place. Ayatollah Khomeini was able to capture all of that resentment from the more conservative parts of society, the middle class of society, rural farmers, pretty much everyone, and translate it into his 1979 Islamic revolution. Historian Ervand Abrahamian even said, quote, "The White Revolution had been designed to preempt a Red Revolution. Instead, it paved the way for an Islamic revolution," end quote. So, big whoops. Whoops there, whoops in Chile. There are others that you'll listen to as well in my bonus episodes, but overall, the spread of communism was a crazy time. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss out on the AP World History fun.